I'm very interested about, very passionate, and it involves jury metrics. This is joint work with Jay Cadane. It started while I was still a PhD student. It took a long time to complete. And Jay is a professor of statistics at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm currently affiliated to the Federal University of São Carlos in Brazil. Okay, so before I talk about specifically indemnity for the loss of a chance, I'll start talking about jury metrics, which is the subject in which this particular topic is inserted. So what is jury metrics? I believe that the term was first used in 1948 by an American scholar named Lee Levinger. And basically, it means applying quantitative methods to the law. And so this has a very large scope. Many types of investigations are included in this general definition. What types of investigations can we, or applications can we imagine? For example, we can look at the regulatory decision making. So Congress has to approve given laws, right? And these laws have economical consequences. They have political consequences, several consequences to society, right? And we might want to might want to do some type of quantitative analysis to understand what are the impacts of these laws to society, and let's say, what is the optimal choice of the law that we can pass in Congress. So there's a type of analysis that I did together with the Brazilian Association of Jury Metrics, in which we have a law here in Brazil. The value which is being asked in courts is small. These people don't have to pay judicial fees in general. So then there's the question: what is the consequence of not having to pay judicial fees in the behavior of people? And actually they don't have to pay any type of fees. So they don't have to pay fees to lawyers in general. And if they lose the case, they don't have to pay a type of fee that happens if you lose a case. And then we investigated this, and we couldn't find out what's the behavior of people when you have this type of fee, and what is the behavior of people in general if they're taking the optimal decisions, right? If there is this type of fee. And then you can present this, and you have a more informed decision whether you want to make these people not pay the fee or not, right? So this is, let's say, in the highest level, you're looking at how lawmaking affects society. Besides this, you can also look at how the judiciary system impacts society, right? So judges, they make their decisions, and these goes to higher level judges, which goes to the Supreme Court and so on. And in the end, you have a decision, and you can look at how society relies on these decisions and how it impacts on society. So let's say if the judiciary takes too long of a time, or if there's no judicial security, in the sense that people don't know exactly what the judges will decide, this might generate many costs to society, which might understanding where these costs come from and how to deal with them. It is possible to influence, to improve society in general, right? So besides the lawmaker, the judiciary system also has impacts on society, and quantitative investigations allow us to understand what type of impact is happening and how we can improve this impact on society. Besides this, there's also the problem of court administration. So then we are entering in a let's say in a lower type, a lower tier, smaller dimension of questions. And here we know that courts, they have an internal organization. So there are clerks, there are all types of judicial servants which work on a court and which have several types of tasks. And there's also, of course, the judge inside of the court who performs a lot of tasks in the decision making, right? So we have many questions about how to manage these courts in such a way, what type of cases go to each type of judge, and how are the legal servants organized in a way such that we have a better quality of decisions, and mainly to get quick decisions, right? In Brazil, there's a joke that they teach in law school, in which they say that law is actually hereditary law. So too long, right? It's only a joke. It doesn't really work like that, right? But legal decisions can take a long time. Example, do specialist judges that only admit a certain type of case, do these judges improve the quality of decisions? Can they take faster decisions, especially if you have a hard type of investigation? Let's say, for example, commercial decisions, right? In which you're studying whether a big company went bankrupt or not. It's a very specific type of question in which maybe a specialist judge can be more efficient than a generalist judge. And similarly, can you organize the judicial staff in such a way that they report to many judges simultaneously, and you can get more efficiency from the staff? There are several questions, and to answer them, they're all precise questions, right? They involve quantification. So jury metrics can improve a lot in court administration. Then there's this even more specific topic here, which is legal theory. And this is the topic that I will talk today. And it's really an intersection between a legal analysis and a statistical analysis. So society today is much more complex than it was 100 years ago. And one of the characteristics of this complexity is uncertainty, right? We have to deal with uncertainty every day. Let's say in the stock market, let's say in the commercial relationships that we have. So uncertainty is a part of modern life. And therefore, legal theory has to cope with uncertainty, right? And the modern way of coping with uncertainty is using probability theory statistics. And so there's this interesting intersection between these two areas. And I'll talk about, I'll exemplify this type of question with today's presentation. And then there's forensic science, right? It's much more consolidated. Let's say if you turn on the TV and watch CSI, for example, right, a television show, it's all about forensic science. So I won't enter too much into this also. And there are many other types of applications, but these are some of the main applications that we see in jury metrics. So I just wanted to give you guys a taste of a lot of interesting questions that are still open. I'm sure that in all South America, there's still a lot to do in understanding all of these questions in jury metrics, right? And actually in all the world, right? So these are there's a growing attention in these questions. For example, in NIPS, one of these fancy congresses in neuroscience, a few years ago, there was a special session in applications of machine learning to the law. So there are a lot of people interested in this type of questions. Okay, but no further ados. Let's get into the main dish. So I'm going to talk about indemnity for the loss of a chance. And this is inside a theme, right, a subject in law, which is called civil liability. What is civil liability? It basically says if someone damages you, right, if someone under certain conditions gives you a damage, they have to repair the damage that they did to you. This is civil liability in a very general way, right? And there are some elements that must be present in order for us to obtain civil liability. One of these elements is damage, right? So you have to be damaged. You have to have some kind of economic or personal damage in order for someone have to be responsible for this damage. For this damage to be, then it must be the case that A was the cause for B's damage. Okay. And what does causality mean, right? We have a very specific idea of causality in science. There's kind of a separate branch of causal theory that is developed by lawyers, and that's okay in principle, because there's this saying that law creates its own reality, right? So the law in principle is not constrained by science, but it's open to and learns, let's say, from what science says. But in respect to causality, law has developed its own theory, let's say, and there are some heuristics that are commonly used. So, for example, there's this but-for condition, and you interpret it in the following way. Let's say that there was a car crash. So A crossed the red light and he crashed into your car. Okay, so then there's this but-for condition. So if A hadn't crossed the red light, would the car crash be avoided? Then let's say the question is yes. Let's say the answer is yes. Then this but-for condition proves, so since the car crash was avoided if A followed the law, then you can say that, okay, A's wrongful behavior was the cause for your damage. And then the last element of civil liability is this wrongfulness. So in order for A to be responsible for this damage that he caused, he has to have acted in a wrongful way. So let's say in an illegal way. So let's say that a doctor has a wrong diagnosis for a sickness that you have. If he was behaving in perfect accordance to proper medical guidelines, then although he did do a misdiagnosis, he's not responsible because he didn't behave in a wrongful manner. But if this doctor was negligent, let's say, he didn't pay proper care to your description of the symptoms or so on, okay, then you have wrongfulness. So if there's also damage and causality, then he is responsible for your damage. So this is the general theme of causality, of civil liability, sorry. But there's a specific type of civil liability that has to do with uncertainty and therefore begs certain statistical questions. And this is the civil liability for the loss of a chance. in the civil liability for the loss of chance, the damage is precisely the chance to obtain a more desired. In the car crash, the damage was the damage that was done directly to your car, right? There's no chance involved. There's a clear real damage that happened. But let's say that a lawyer, you hire a lawyer, and this lawyer loses a deadline for an appeal. So he loses a deadline. And if he loses a deadline, then you lose your case. But does this mean that you lost the, was your damage what you were asking for in the court? No, not exactly this, because even though the lawyer lost this deadline, then it's still not guaranteed that you would gain the case, right? Even if a lawyer behaves perfectly, you might still lose a case. So what was actually lost? What you lost was the chance of appealing your previous decision and perhaps winning the case, right? So you are losing a chance. And this chance doesn't have the same value as what you were asking for, right? Probably it has a smaller value than what you were asking for, this lost chance. In a similar way, there might be medical malpractice, right? So a physician doesn't perform perfectly according to medical guidelines. He's negligent, or he does something ill-intentioned, right? So sometimes even if a physician acts perfectly according to medical guidelines, it's no sure thing that you would recover from your bad condition. So you're not losing your recovery. That's not your damage. What you're losing is the chance of your recovery. And this is an idea that courts are slowly digesting. It's a difficult idea because they are not completely most considerations in the judiciary are considerations about certainties, and here we are having to deal with chance, right? Another type of example is, let's say that there's a racial discrimination at work for the promotion process. So even if there was no racial discrimination, it's no guarantee that the person would be promoted. But certainly the racial discrimination is decreasing the chances of that this person is promoted. So there's of course some value that the person should be repaired for, but it's not exactly the value of the promotion. It's the value for the chance of the promotion. And there's this Millionaire case in Brazil. I'll enter this in more details in the end of the presentation. But it's basically a multiple choice question which had no correct answer. And then the person lost the chance of answering to this multiple choice question. But even had he answered, there's still the chance that he would get the question wrong. So he lost the chance of being presented a properly formulated question, which is different from getting the question right. So these are some examples of civil liability for the loss of a chance. And then of course there's now starts the trouble, right? So if this type of damage is repairable, then you have a precise question, right? A question of quantification, which is what is the value of this chance? And what I will try to show to you is that in order to value this type of chance, there is a tight connection between legal questions and also statistical questions. And we will look very deep into this connection and see how it influences quantification. Okay. So first, let's start with a medical malpractice, a common medical malpractice example, in which there's, let's say, a doctor, and due to a problem in diagnosis, let's say that negligence of the doctor, he didn't perform a surgery which might avoid the victim's leg amputation, right? And specifically, let's say that without this type of medical misdiagnosis, the probability that the person had his leg amputated would be P0, and with medical misdiagnosis, the probability that the person has his leg amputated is P1. And the value of avoiding leg amputation is this delta V. So then the question is, okay, and let's say that in the end the leg was amputated, okay, due to this medical misdiagnosis. Then the question is, how much of the delta V, right? How much of the leg amputation, the damage due to leg amputation, is the doctor responsible for? And if you look into the literature, if you look into jurisprudence, there are several formulas that have been proposed. So for example, P1 minus P0, right, the difference in the probabilities times the value of the leg amputation. Another formula is P1 minus P0 over 1 minus P1 times delta V. So you can see that there's a factor of 1 minus P1 that delta V. And okay, there are several proposed formulas. How bad is this? Well, it can be very bad. So if the value of P0, let's say, is 95%, and the value of P1 is 90%, and you apply these formulas, and let's say that the value of delta V is, let's say, 1,000, then it's possible to obtain quantifications that vary by a factor of 10. So one of these formulas might give you a compensation of $1,000, and another of these formulas might give you a quantification of about $10,000. So this is a serious issue, right? People who have very similar damages might get very different quantifications just because of a challenge in understanding what formula to use, or what is the proper way of doing this type of quantification. And there's very little justification for each of these formulas in the literature. Well, now we wrote a paper which is published in Law, Probability and Risk, which discusses this. But before, there was very little justification for why should one use each one of these formulas. So you can see that this generates instability, right? If there's no justification for these formulas and people are using them at a chance, then, well, you don't know. You might get 1,000, you might get 10,000. It all depends on which formula is used. So it's important to dive deeper into what's behind these formulas and understand what are the legal considerations behind them, and which one is more adequate to each legal system. Okay. So we'll start entering into this question now. And our proposal is to identify relevant legal considerations when we have these types of loss chances, evaluate what are the possible answers, still qualitative answers to these legal considerations, and then we will translate these answers into statistical statements. So statements that are precise from a probabilistic point of view. And using these steps, we can obtain both legal justifications for each one of these formulas and also precise statements about what is the proper way of doing quantification for these types of loss chances. And we will do this type of translation using the framework of decision theory, right? Subjective utility decision theory. So this will be the main machine that is behind the type of considerations that we will perform. Okay, so if we are going to do decision theory, then a first part is identifying what are the elements of loss chances, which will be precisely the elements that are used in decision theory. And now I will start talking about these elements. But before I start, I would like to know if is everything making sense? Does anyone have need a clarification, or can I continue? Okay, there's something in the chat. Oh, good. Okay, so I'll continue. So we have the what are the elements of these loss chances? The first type of elements is the outcomes, right? So what are the outcomes? They're a set of mutually exclusive options, which represent all that can happen to the victim. So for example, in the car crash example, there might be a car crash or there might not be a car crash, for example. In the medical misdiagnosis problem, the victim might have a leg amputation, or the victim might not have a leg amputation. Or for example, in another type of medical misdiagnosis, the person might die or the person might not die. And then there's a very important thing, which is really to consider precisely what are the possible outcomes. So in general, for example, outcomes might be how long will the person live, right? So then you have a quantification in time, right? How long will the person live, and with what quality of life, right? So these are many ways of investigating the possible outcomes, the legally relevant possible outcomes in these loss chances. But we will see two random variables, which usually are dependent. And we have the victim's outcome in the factual scenario, which I will call O1. And the factual scenario is with what actually happened, right? Outcome in the counterfactual scenario. And here is where causality pays a big importance, right? What is the counterfactual scenario? It's a scenario that we are imagining in which the wrongful action did not occur, right? So for example, there's this scenario in which the physician performed misdiagnosis. Then you have to imagine from a legal point of view, another scenario in which the physician did not perform medical misdiagnosis. And then you have to understand what happened to the victim. Of course, the variables O0 and O1 in general, they are dependent, right? Because it's the same person that's being considered. So the result in the factual scenario has some dependence with the result in the counterfactual scenario. And we can represent, but before I get into this representation, we can say V of an outcome, O, is the victim's utility for this outcome. And in the end, we need utility and not only outcome, because there's this aspect of the judiciary system that the only thing that the judiciary can give you is money, right? That's the way that you are repaired for the damage. You can't make the physician grow another leg for you, right? The only thing that you can do is repair giving money. And of course, there's a very difficult question about how much money is equivalent to losing a leg. But this is a question that the judiciary system already had, right? There's nothing new that lost chances are bringing into the table. And there's a very difficult area of law, which is really understanding what is the value of a lost leg in terms of money, let's say. But we won't get into this now. The thing is, we have to transform outcomes, which are elements of your sample space, into real values, right? And this is what the utility is doing. It's transforming an outcome into a real value, and then real value we can transform into money. Of course, the utility doesn't have to be linear with money. There are some psychological phenomena that we observe. So, for example, people usually tend to avoid risks, right? And the risk avoidance can be understood as the value of money actually being a concave function, right? So the utility of money doesn't have to be linear. So if I give you $10, that doesn't have to be 10 times as valuable as receiving $1. Because of this, for example, because of this risk avoidance that has been observed since Bernoulli. But using utility, so you can get the victim's utility under the factual scenario. Let's say another scenario that there was misdiagnosis and he lost a leg, and also under the counterfactual scenario here, which is V1. And these two, since V0 and V1 are functions of random variables, they are also random variables. And these two random variables may be dependent. And we model this dependence in an influence diagram that we have here by adding this common node here, F, which points both to O0 and to O1. So using this influence diagram, we can see that generally V0 and V1 can be dependent. Okay. And besides V0 and V1, O0 and O1 and F, we also have a quantification function. So in order to define a quantification function, we have this capital K here, which is the amount of information that can be used to quantify damages. And I'll get more into this in a few slides. But basically, there's several times that are of interest, right? There's a time before the damage. There's a time, let's say, when the wrongful action was performed. And there's a time in which the consequences of the wrongful action are known. So for example, there's a time of the misdiagnosis, and then later there's a time in which you know that your leg was actually amputated. And up to, let's say you can have the question, up to which point of time can you use the information about what happened to compensate the victim? How much information can be used? And this is not only a statistical question, this is a legal question also, right? Society determines how much information can be used to quantify damages. And there are reasons to use more, and there are reasons to use less information. And we will see which outcome of how much damage quantification, so how much money should the victim receive, right? There's function Q. and a measure theory way of describing Q in terms of capital K, a sub-sigma field, right, of the sigma field of O1, which are the outcomes of the victim, and Q must be a capital K measurable function. But for people who don't know measure theory, you just have to think that Q is a function that can only use the information that is allowed by capital K. Okay, so these are the elements of loss chances. There's the outcome, both in the factual and the counterfactual scenario. There's the victim's utility, both in the factual and in the counterfactual scenario. And there's this quantification rule. And this is exactly what we are trying to determine, the quantification rule, right? We want to know exactly what is the formula that is used to quantify the values of the victim. Okay, so these are all the elements, and we want to determine Q. But we can't determine Q from a statistical point of view alone. We have to understand what are the legal restrictions, right? What are the legal principles? What is the law? And how does the law determine how to quantify damages? And only then can we find out this function Q. And I will talk about 3 legal questions that are very relevant for understanding Q and how we translate these legal questions into statistical probabilistic considerations. Okay, so these are the principles of quantification. The first question is exactly how much information can be used to quantify damages. So remember that after at the end, right, of a long time, you observe the value of O1, which is the factual scenario. What happened to the victim in the factual scenario? So, for example, in the misdiagnosis case, the victim might observe that his leg was amputated, right? Or if the person doesn't know how long he will survive, then he observed that after a given amount of time, the person died, let's say. So then there's this question of how much information about the victim's final outcome can be used to quantify damages. And there's a question about, there's a, let's say, a conflict or antinomy between 2 principles or 2 societal values, which are predictability and reparation. In terms of predictability, the more information that you allow to be used, the more uncertain the person who commits the wrongful action is about how much he will have to pay in the future, because he doesn't know what's going to happen later on with O1. So let's say that there's this doctor who performs a medical misdiagnosis, but there's still some chance that the leg won't be amputated. Only after surgery, which will happen, let's say, in a month, will he know whether the leg was amputated or not. And if you let everything, all information be used, at the time that he performs misdiagnosis, he doesn't know how much he will have to pay in the future. So there's this question of predictability. And there's an article written by a guy named Fisher, which the reference is in the paper. And he talks about this case, let's say, in which a person has a yearbook shop, and yearbooks, they usually are cheap. Let's say they cost $1 because they're yearbooks of a lot of people, right? Unknown people, people who are not famous. And at that time, someone set on fire. But 30 years later, we find out that it was Janis Joplin's yearbook. After Janis Joplin became very famous, and at the time the person put fire on the yearbook, Janis Joplin was unknown; she wasn't famous yet. So should the person be responsible for this $1, the value of a yearbook signed by Janis Joplin, which is very expensive these days, right? It all depends. It all depends whether we want the decision to be predictable or not. How much information we should use about the value of this yearbook? Should we use all the information that is available in the present, or do we have to restrict ourselves to only the information that was available at the time of the wrongful action? There are a couple of possible answers that we investigate. Oh, I changed the slide for some reason. Sorry. There are a couple possible answers that we can investigate. One of them is no information. So we can use nothing about O1 to quantify damages. So only, let's say you could only use the information in the yearbook example, that is, it was a yearbook of an unknown person, let's say. Another question is, another possible answer, let's say, is some information, or only a binary type of information. You can only say if in the end the person got a result that was better than the expected result without the wrongful action, or whether it was better or worse than this expected outcome with the in the counterfactual scenario. And sorry, here the indicator should be indicated that V1, right, the real value, is greater than the expected value of V0. I can't do this with outcomes. So in the end, only a bit of information can be used, 1 or 0. And the idea is you only want to repair people that actually suffer the damage in the end, right? You don't want to you don't want to have to give a price, a reparation value to everyone, even if they didn't suffer a damage in the end. So this is the idea of using only some information. And of course, there's a different value besides predictability, which is reparation. Reparation means that you want to really undo the damage that was actually done in the end to the victim, right? And how do you provide an exact reparation? You can only give an exact reparation if you use all the information of O1, right? If you know exactly what happened to the victim and use all of this information to determine the quantification value. So the third idea here is everything, all the information in O1, everything that happened in the factual scenario can use for quantifying damages. And which one of these answers to use has nothing to do with statistics. It has to do with a value in society, right? And each society can have different values, can have different ideas of what to protect, and therefore give different answers to these questions. So this is the first question that we will consider. Then another question is, how are the factual and counterfactual scenarios related? So remember that there was this F random variable which determined the dependence between O0 and O1. But law is not restricted to understanding causality in the same way as science, right? So how can these scenarios be related? Well, one of them is, okay, law might defer to an expert witness to determine, based on evidence, what is the relation between the factual and the counterfactual scenarios. But this can be very expensive, right? If you need to put an expert witness into a case, then he will have fees, right? And sometimes the fees of the expert witness might be more expensive than what's being discussed. So maybe law doesn't want to decide what is the relation between factual and counterfactual scenarios solely based on evidence. And some other possible answers might be, okay, the law will consider that O0 and O1 are assumed to be independent, even though they might not be independent in reality. And another possible answer would be this maximum proximity. So we will choose a coupling between V0 and V1, which minimizes their difference, their quadratic difference. And determining this coupling is a very known problem. It's known as the Monge-Kontorovich coupling problem between these two random variables V0 and V1. And there's an analytical solution in general to this problem. Okay, so these are three possible questions, three possible answers to these questions. That's we will consider is what is the definition of indemnity, right? So we said that indemnity, right, is repairing a damage. But what does reparation mean? One of the possible answers is when we want to bring the victim as close as possible to the utility that she would obtain in the counterfactual scenario. So what are we saying here? So the value in the counterfactual scenario should be as close as possible to the value that was actually obtained in the factual scenario, plus the monetary amount that is the quantification of the damage, right? So the monetary amount that would be awarded to the victim. So this is one possible answer. We want to it's the answer based on repairing the damage. But there's another type of consideration that sometimes they say that wrongful action or the liability should not be seen as a winning ticket. So the person should be indifferent between not being wronged and being wronged and receiving reparation. And one way of writing this is that expected value of V0 is equal to the expected value of V1 plus Q, right? And it seems like these things might not be so different, right? But one thing that is really important to take into consideration here is that if the victim actually obtains in the factual scenario something that is better than in the counterfactual scenario, and this can in principle happen, right? So if V1 is greater than V0, you cannot fine the victim, right? Q cannot be negative. So what happens is that sometimes V0 will be different from V1 plus Q, and V1 plus Q can even be greater than V0. So in order for this to happen, and you still have, for you to still have that the expected value of V0 is equal to expected value of V1 plus Q, then in some cases you have to have the opposite inequality, right? You must have that V1 plus Q is smaller than V0 in some cases for this expected value to hold. So there's some tension between perfectly repairing the victim and making the reparation not to be a winning ticket, right? It's different from making the victim indifferent between not being wronged and being wronged. And these are two possible answers. And again, there's no statistical answer to which is the correct possible answer. This is a question of values, society of values. and it's a question that once answered by society, then the statistician can help doing the quantification. But it's a question that society has to answer. And okay, so I gave some translations. I was stating the answers and already the possible translations of these answers. And then, okay, now we can, based on these answers, find out what is the value of Q. What are the correct formulas? And let me just check how much time I have. It seems I have about 5 more minutes, right? So I'll just exemplify the formulas. So if the answer is that you can use no information, let's say, which is I1, right? Then the quantification Q would be the maximum between 0 and the difference of the expected value between V0 and V1. So it's either 0 or a single number, no matter what happens. That's what has to happen, right? Because you are using no information. Then if you have I2, you only have a binary answer, right? Either you got a result that was better or worse than your expected result in the counterfactual scenario. Then this is the formula that you have in the end. So it's, you get 0 if your scenario is better than the expected value in the counterfactual scenario. And otherwise, you get the expected value of V0 minus V1, given the fact that you are in this scenario in which you got a worse result than in the counterfactual scenario. And then here, there's another possible formula here. If you use R2, remember that this is the case in which you still have to maintain the expected values of the formulas to be of V0 to be equal to the expected value of V1 plus Q. So you have this other formula here that has a factor of P of this probability of you being in the counterfactual in the positive counterfactual scenario, right? So it's just the third formula is just a second formula over this probability. And then if you can use all information, then if you want total repairment, then the value of the quantification is the maximum between 0 and the expected value of V0 minus V1, given all of the information in O1. And then in the scenario in which you want the indifference, being not suffering the damage and suffering the damage and receiving this monetary restitution, then you should receive the same thing as in the previous case, but subtracted by a value of lambda. And this lambda is chosen precisely so that the expected value of Q is equal to the expected value of V0 minus V1. So now we see that formulas for damage quantification. And in the case in which we have medical misdiagnosis, we can see that we obtain several formulas that were obtained in the literature. So we can see here that we obtain P0 minus P1 times delta V in the case that no information can be used, right? It can be used. You have to give this monetary compensation for all victims, no matter if their leg was amputated or not, right? In the end of the medical misdiagnosis. So just because there was medical misdiagnosis, the person would have to be compensated, no matter if in the end there was this actual damage of amputation or not. And then we can see here that if you assume independence, which is one of these assumptions here, then you have P0 times delta V. And in all other scenarios, we have this other formula, which is P0 if there is amputation and 0 otherwise. And there's a there's one way of understanding this formula. Let's say that you have 100. Let's say that you have 5 white balls and 95, or let's say that you have 95 white balls in which represent not having a damage, and you have 5 red balls which represent that you have a damage. And let's say that misdiagnosis means that a person painted 2 of these red balls as white. So before you had 5 red balls, and now you have only he painted 3, right? So now you only have 2 red balls. Oh, sorry, this doesn't make sense. The person should paint some of the balls red, right? Because that's increasing the probability of having a bad outcome. The bad outcome is represented by the red balls. So before you have 5, and the person paints 5 more balls as red, right? So 5 balls used to be white, and now all of them, or all of these 5 balls which used to be white or red. And then the person gets a random ball from the urn, and he sees that it's red. So then the question is, what is the probability that you would get a white ball had the person not painted some of these balls red? The question is, the answer is not 5/100. You have to condition that you got a red ball. So there are 10 red balls, but without painting 5 of the red balls, of the white balls red, white balls out of these red balls, and 5 red balls that were actually red in the beginning. So the probability that that in the counterfactual scenario you would get a red ball is half, given the fact that you got a red ball in the factual scenario. So that's where P0 minus P1 over 1 minus P1 comes from. It's one way of understanding this. Okay, so this is an application to medical misdiagnosis. There's another application to promotion discrimination, and it's more interesting because there are several outcomes. There are many. The formulas give time. Do I have time to present this case?
I don't mind. You can go on, Rafael.
I can go on. Okay, so I'll go on quickly. So in this case, the person could be promoted in 1997, 1998, or not be promoted at all. And here are the probabilities that the person is promoting under a fair process on top, and the probability that the person is promoted under an unfair process. So you can see that the probability that the person is not promoted increases, sorry, under the unfair process. And the probability that the person is promoted in 1997 decreases. But there's this funny thing that the probability that the person, not funny, but surprising thing, that the probability that the person is promoted in 1998 actually increases, right? A lot of the probability from 1997 is going to 1998. So this value increases. And then the question is, okay, if this is the case, what value should the person receive as compensation? And here's the table of the values. I won't go into further details here. It's just an application of the formula, but there are some results that are kind of surprising. So here the outcome, this is the factual outcome, right? So if the person is actually promoted in 1997, you can see that except for I1, all of the other answers give the value 0, right? Because the person already in the factual scenario, the person actually got the best possible outcome. So only if you can use no information would this person be compensated. But one answer here, you can see that the person here with ON, which is if the person is not compensated, he gets 286. And if he is promoted in 1998, he gets 2,400, which is greater. Even though the person got a better result, he gets a better repairment value than this person had the person gotten a worse result. So maybe these answers are weird, combining all of these answers in this scenario. But well, that's a question for law to investigate. And there are several different answers that we can obtain here. I won't get too much into the details of how this table was computed, but it's just applying the formulas that I showed previously. And then there's this Millionaire Case. I don't know if there's a similar version of the Millionaire Case in Chile or in the rest of South America. But it's a program in which the person answers several multiple choice questions, and every time he answers correctly, he gains a larger prize. But if he answers incorrectly, he loses everything that he got until now, and the person accumulated until then. And there's a case in which the victim had accumulated a prize of $500,000, and she could decide between answering and getting $1,000 if the answer was correct, and getting nothing if the answer was incorrect, or stopping and getting $500,000. And this case went up into the question had no correct answer. And I won't get too much into the specifics of the decision of the court, but we provided an alternative analysis here, in which we considered both that the person has risk aversion, so the value of money is not linear, right? Getting $5,000, getting $500,000 is not just half the value of getting $1 million. And we can see here what is the amount of compensation based on what is the probability of getting a correct answer, right? So this depends on, it might be a hard question, determining what is the probability of getting a correct answer, which the court developed. But then you can see here that the amount of compensation depends a lot on how much risk aversion is taken into consideration, right? But the other dotted line here is the scenario in which we have no risk aversion, so the utility grows linearly with money. Then we can see here if the person has a probability half of getting the answer right. That's when a person with no risk aversion starts being repaired, getting a monetary value for her damages. And if her probability of answering correctly is 1, then she would get the $500,000 more than the $500 that she already got in the Millionaire Case by stopping, right? So then her compensation would be $500,000. While if she had a very high risk aversion, then she would only start being compensated if her probability of getting the answer correct was about 91.5. And you can see that the curve increases until the same value if her probability of $500,000 of compensation, if her probability of getting the answer correct is 1. Thank you very much for everyone who watched, and for the organizing committee for inviting me to present.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for your speech. It's very enlightening to see how we can apply Bayesian statistics as we are dealing with random probability. data parameter, and then how can we apply directly the decision theory based on the information that we can use, maybe incorporate on the whole system of quantification. If now we can open the questions. If someone has question, I do already have one question for you. Um, I I would like to see your perspective in practice. How could we elicitate priors towards this damage quantification? Usually, because in most of your talk, you said we always condition to the society. So in this manner, all the outcomes would be based on some common sense or decisions, previous decision. How could we adjust this as a prior elicitation in this decision making?
Well, yes, there are probability considerations all over the talk, right? So what is the probability of obtaining something in the factual, or what is the coupling of these scenarios? These are all hard questions. What court usually does when you have a problem of eliciting probabilities is that people can bring into court expert witnesses, right? So experts in the field, and these experts can will give their probability estimates, which might be based on facts or based only on on the fact that they're experts and they have a lot of experience, right? And then each part will bring their expert witness, and these expert witnesses might have his own experts, and his experts will condense the other two experts and bring a summary of his conclusions to the judge, right? Usually that's how it's done. Of course, this is what happens for big cases, right, in which a lot of money is involved. For a small case, there's not enough money at risk to justify bringing so many experts, right? It's very expensive to hire them. So in many times the elicitation is performed by the judge, right? And the parts might bring some statistics. So what is the fraction of people who recover from this disease when they are properly diagnosed, right? And then each one of these parts will bring these statistics, and it will be up to the judge to come up with his elicitation. Of course, this is very dangerous, but it's you have to see that there are monetary considerations also at risk there, right?
Yes.
So it's a very tough question, this idea of elicitation, and it's well, it's already hard for Bayesian in science, right? But in law, it can be very, very, very difficult. My advisor, Jay Cadane, he wrote a book called Statistics in the Law, in which he shows several cases in which he did probability elicitation as an expert witness. So I really recommend reading this book. It's very interesting. It might give you some ideas about how he did his elicitation.
Definitely, definitely. And this is a great idea, not always just for Bayesians, but also for the frequentists, how to add some bias on their estimation, right?
Oh yeah, that's for sure. We already discussed this previously many times.
We also open for other questions if somebody would like to ask for Professor Rafael. Well, if no one has a question, I would personally thank you very much, Rafael, for accepting our invitation. It's always great to see different fields where statistics can go for, and definitely law is a field that it's a very promising, given this all data science, machine learning revolution, that deeply inside it's pure statistics. So thank you very much, Rafael, and we keep in touch.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. We'll see each other. Bye-bye.
Milton?